Hey everybody, it's Jay here again with Bicycle Motorsports, and this video is a tutorial on how you go about removing the manufacturer bearings from your 66cc motor crankcase, and also how you go about installing new and, in this case, better quality aftermarket bearings. Before I begin, this video was sponsored by CST Bearing Company. They were kind enough to provide the bearings that are being used in this video, which are right here. They're SKF bearings made in Italy, very good quality. I highly recommend using these if you're going to be replacing the old bearings in the motor. A few things before we start. There's these little rubber seals that you'll find right here and here. They come out easy enough. You just take a screwdriver and pry them out. Set them aside, don't lose them. What I have here is a bearing puller tool right here. This is my first time using this particular tool, so hopefully everything goes according to plan. So the first bearing that I'm going to remove is this main bearing right here. Take the bearing puller, just set it in there, make sure these two arms are loose. This black piece right here is what keeps the two legs in place and keeps them so they lock into the center of the bearing. So turn that counterclockwise so they're loose. Insert it into the bearing, and then just turn it clockwise to lock the legs into place. And one thing I did notice when I did a small trial run of this tool was that the legs had a tendency to come close together again and pop out upon trying to pull out the bearing. So I took this cut piece of if I can find it, because I set it right here, I took this end of a mill file and cut it off because it tapers, and I just insert it between the two legs and take a hammer and tap it into place, and then continue tightening the black piece. Now you don't have to use this piece of metal that I obtained from the mill file. You can use a screw or a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, and just wedge it in there. So you want to make sure this is really tight. And then you just take a wrench and start turning clockwise. And the bearing popped out that fast. Not exactly as I intended for it to come out, but it did come out. It just popped right out. So to get the bearing off, just turn this black piece again counterclockwise. And it comes right off. Set that aside and we move on to the next bearing. We'll go ahead and take this one out. Now we take this metal piece, again we hammer it, and then start turning this nut clockwise. And there we have it. So, alright, one half of the crankcase now has the bearings removed. Set that aside. Alright, and now we move to the other main bearing right here. Drop it in. And then we take this piece again and do the same thing. Actually, these are protruding a little too much, so I'm going to go back and pull them up a little bit. And out it comes. I'm not too concerned about hitting these bearings because I'm probably never going to use them again, so I don't have to worry about any damage occurring or anything like that. Alright, so we have one more bearing to go. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Alright, now that I have the bearings out of the two crankcase halves, I'm going to go ahead and clean out all of this old oil and two-stroke fuel and the grease and everything that you see here. So we'll pick up from here once I get this all cleaned up, and we'll insert the new bearings. Okay, now that I have everything all cleaned up, I'm ready to install the new bearings. One thing I also wanted to mention is once I mentioned to the CST Bearing Company what I was using these bearings for and what I needed, they offered to and actually did remove the seals from two of the bearings. It's not overly difficult to remove them, but it was just something they offered, and I took them up on that, so that was pretty cool of them to do. Made things a little easier. Okay, so I'm going to install one of these main bearings here. Make sure that the main bearings in the crankcase that you're using have both seals on each side removed. And another thing you want to make sure you do is insert this bearing as evenly, like so that it's sitting flush. You can use a rubber mallet to make sure that it's in there firmly, so that when you start pulling through using this tool, it doesn't pull through unevenly. And it looks like it's in there pretty evenly. I'll tap it a little more. That's safe to do as long as you're using a rubber mallet. You don't want to damage the bearing. Okay, a little bit more. And that looks pretty good. We go ahead and take the bearing puller, and you also want to make sure that the puller is sitting level, that it's not lopsided in any way, otherwise it won't pull the bearing through properly, and the bearing might end up lopsided or sitting inside the crankcase uneven. Okay, that's almost all the way in. Just check it over, make sure it looks good, and just a little bit more to go. All right. That is in there all the way, and it looks good. Now we take one of the fully enclosed bearings with both seals on and put that in next. grab my rubber mallet. Alright, let's start pulling it through. Okay, so I actually just went over to a more solid surface other than this work table that I'm using. It's somewhat flimsy, so I took the crankcase over to a more solid surface, like I said, laid the bearing in there and placed a small piece of wood over top of the bearing and tapped it into place about halfway, just so that when I start pulling it through the rest of the way with the tool, it doesn't start going lopsided again. So yeah, I mean, you guys can do the exact same thing. Just make sure you do your best to protect the bearing. And it's good to go. It's sitting in there just the way it should be. Set this half of the crankcase aside. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other two bearings, which is lay them in there, go over to a solid work surface, and put a piece of wood between the bearing and the hammer and just tap it in so that it goes in evenly the rest of the way. Okay, so I've now tapped both of these bearings into place. That way, when I start pulling them through the rest of the way with this tool, they go in perfectly aligned. You can see the bearing is sitting in there just the way it should be, with about 1/16 of an inch of the edge of the bearing rising up past the casting of the crankcase. And now we have one more bearing to go. Okay, that's sitting in there just where it should be. I'll compare to the other half of the crankcase to see if the depth is the same as the other bearing, which it is. So that is it. That's all it takes. Little bit of elbow grease and the right tools, and replacing the bearings in your 66cc crankcase motor is a relatively easy process, not too challenging. The type of bearings that you want to use and purchase are 6202 2RSHC3. I'll leave a link in the description box below with the model of these bearings and the eBay store for CST Bearing Company. They have a really good selection, so I recommend giving them a look and see what they have to offer. All right, if you guys have any questions, comments, leave them in the comment box below. And if you found the video helpful or informative, please like and subscribe.